Greetings to everyone and welcome back once again to my educational channel on biology. I'm teacher Janet and today we'll be discussing Biology Form 4 subtopic 12.3 entitled Neurons and the Synapse. Let's find out how neurons or nerve cells are specially adapted to transmit nerve impulses efficiently throughout the nervous system for the survival of the organism. Then we are going to also study about the synapse, which is a gap between two neurons. Let's find out how impulses are transmitted across the synapse. The learning standards for today's lesson are as follows. 12.3 Neurons and Synapses. Firstly, we should be able to draw and label structures of a sensory neuron and a motor neuron after this lesson. So the parts of the neurons include the dendrites, myelin sheath, axon, nodes of Ranvier, and cell body. Secondly, we should be able to analyze the functions of each type of neuron in impulse transmission. Thirdly, explain the structure and function of a synapse. And fourthly, explain the transmission of impulses across a synapse. So, the transmission of impulses across a synapse is very important for SPM essay question and also structured questions. So 12.3 Neurons and Synapse. So firstly, we're going to discuss neurons, and then after that, we'll discuss the synapse. Now, the nervous system is made up of millions of nerve cells known as neurons. So a neuron is a cell that's very specialized. It is a nerve cell and it's very specialized. And what's the basic structure of a neuron? Okay, so the structure is like something like, you know, when you look at your hand, it has 5 fingers, you just spread it out. All right, so this is like the palm of the hand, and then this is the arm. All right, so just to help you to remember the basic structure of a neuron. All right, so a neuron consists of the cell body here, which contains the nucleus and cytoplasm, and then it has the dendrites, which transmit impulses to the cell body. It has an axon here, which transmit nerve impulses away from the cell body, and then on the axon, it may be coated. The axon may be coated with a myelin sheath to protect it. Then the gaps in between the myelin sheath are called nodes of Ranvier, and finally the axon branches out to form many branches that end in the swelling called the synaptic knot. Let's find out more about the functions and structure of the various parts, the structure and the functions of the various parts of the neuron. So firstly, we're going to talk about the structure of a neuron. And we'll take the example of a motor neuron, which is a type of neuron that transmits nerve impulses from the central nervous system, such as the brain or spinal cord, to the effectors. So let's look at the parts of a motor neuron. Okay, now first of all, motor neurons and all other neurons, they have a cell body. So the cell body consists of the nucleus and the surrounding cytoplasm, and it has tiny projections sticking out, which we call dendrites. These are cytoplasmic projections that help to transmit impulses towards the cell body. So the function of the cell body here is to integrate the signals coming in from the dendrites and to coordinate the metabolic activities of the cell. Next, let's talk about the dendrites. Now, a dendrite is a short branch of the cell body, okay, projecting out from the cell body. Its function is to receive nerve impulses from other neurons nearby to it or from the external environment, and to transmit these impulses to the cell body, towards the cell body, okay? So they receive and they transmit the impulses towards the cell body, right? Now, so the motor neuron has a lot of tiny dendrites, right? Like a tree, you know, with branches, right? So next we have the axon. So what's an axon? Now this shows you the flow of impulses into the dendrite and into the cell body, okay? Now let's look at the axon. So an axon is an elongated branch of the cell body in this case, okay? It's quite long. The axon is quite long for the motor neuron, sometimes reaching up to 1 meter if it's found in the feet or the legs, all right? So an axon is an elongated branch of the cell body, and its function is to transmit impulses out from the cell body, away from the cell body, to other neurons or to effectors like muscles, okay? So it's different, the axon is different from the dendrite. Dendrites transmit impulses to the cell body, but axon transmit impulses out from the cell body to other parts, okay? So this shows you the direction of flow from for the axon from the cell body outwards, okay, to other parts, like to the muscle cells. Next, we have the myelin sheath, which is an insulating membrane that coats the axon. So the myelin sheath contains fatty substances, and it cannot conduct electrical impulses, right? Compared to the axon that can transmit electrical impulses, okay? So the myelin sheath doesn't transmit electrical impulses. It is an insulating membrane, and it has 3 very important functions. Firstly, it protects the neurons, especially the axon, the part called the axon, from injury. Secondly, it is an insulator for electrical impulses. That means it does not transmit electrical impulses, okay? The electrical impulses cannot flow through it, only through the axon. Thirdly, it provides nutrients to the axon within. Now next, we have the node of Ranvier, all right, which are the tiny gaps in between the myelin sheath. So the nodes of Ranvier, seen here and here, are the parts that are not insulated by the myelin sheath, and they are regular gaps along the axon, okay? So this neuron has been shortened. Actually, the axon of the neuron here should be much longer, right? So there are many nodes of Ranvier on the axon. Now, or on the myelin sheath, all right? There are many gaps on the myelin sheath called the nodes of Ranvier. So what is the use of all these gaps? So the node of Ranvier helps to accelerate or speed up the flow of nerve impulses by allowing impulses to jump from one node of Ranvier to the next during the transmission of impulses. All right, like this. Okay, the impulses will not flow inside the axon all the way through the axon fiber or projection. It will jump from one node of Ranvier to the other. So in this way, it speeds up the nerve transmission so that the impulse can travel faster, especially for reflex actions, okay, that occurs very quickly and automatically within less than 1 second. And a reflex action can occur very quickly within less than a second because of the fast transmission of nerve impulses through the axon. All right, where the nerve impulse will jump from one node of Ranvier to the other. Okay, so if there's no myelin sheath, then you won't have node of Ranvier, and the impulse will have to flow through the axon, all the way through the axon, and then the transmission of impulses will be slower, okay, without the myelin sheath and the node of Ranvier. Now, lastly, we have the synaptic knob, which is a swelling at the end of every axon branch. So the axon will branch out at its end here to form many branches called the axon branches. And at the end of the axon branches, every axon branch at its end, there's a swelling called the synaptic knob. Okay, so the function of the synaptic knob is to send the signals, all right, or nerve impulses to muscle cells, gland cells or cells of the glands, or to dendrites of other neurons. We'll be finding out more about the synaptic knob later. Now next, we are going to discuss the 3 different types of neurons, which are the sensory neurons, relay neurons, and motor neurons. So the old term or the alternative term for sensory neuron is afferent neuron. And for relay neuron, the alternative term is interneuron. For motor neuron, it's sometimes called the efferent neuron. Now, for our exam, the KSSM syllabus, and for exam, please use these terms on the left: sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, as is used in the textbook. Okay? So, these other names are only, you can remember them to, in case they are mentioned in certain sources, okay, or certain references. Okay, now, so here, this is a diagram of a sensory neuron, and this one's a relay neuron, and this is a motor neuron. Let's find out more about these 3 types of neurons. We will discuss their structures, location, and also their functions. Now, the first type of neuron we'll study here is the sensory neuron. Okay, so the sensory neuron is very different from the motor neuron that we discussed just now, in that the cell body is situated or located at the side of the neuron, not at the front end of the neuron. Okay, so the cell body is located at the side and a bit further to the end, nearer to the end of the neuron. Okay, so the front part of the neuron is where it is attached to the receptor in sensory organs, right? And then it consists of the dendrites, the tiny dendrites. Then the dendrites combine to form a long dendron. Okay, so some books do mention the word dendron and some do not, and some label this part as dendrite. Okay, so I label it as dendron as it is formed from the combination of all the dendrites here. All right, so this term is used in some books. Now, so dendrons and dendrites transmit the nerve impulses to the cell body of the sensory neuron. After that, the impulse is transmitted away from the cell body by the short axon, okay, to the end of the neuron. So the location of this sensory neuron is in the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Okay, now, so this is the sensory neuron. It's attached to the receptor, to receptors in the sensory organs. And then these are the dendrites. And then this is the long dendron of the sensory neuron. Okay, and then this part here after the cell body is the axon, the short axon of the sensory neuron. Okay, so you can see here the dendron is very long, right? But the axon is shorter, and the axon is shorter. Now, the cell body of the sensory neuron is found in the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, so the cell body is, there's an accumulation of, or a group of cell bodies in the swelling here called the ganglia, the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, so if you look at the structure of the spinal cord in the diagram, you can identify the dorsal root by looking out for the ganglia. Dorsal root has a swelling called the ganglia. Okay, and the dorsal root is nearer to the back of the body, the ventral root is nearer to the front of the body. Okay, so ventral root doesn't have the ganglia, right? Okay, then the function of the sensory neuron is to carry nerve impulses from receptors, all right, to, in the sensory organs, to the central nervous system. Okay, now from receptors to the central nervous system, such as the spinal cord or brain. So what is the flow of impulse like? Starting with the receptor here. So receptor, when the receptor is stimulated by, let's say, the stimulus of pain, it will generate an impulse, and the impulse will be transmitted by the dendrites here, and then the dendron of the sensory neuron to the cell body, and then from the cell body to the axon, and then into the gray matter of the spinal cord, and here to the next neuron, which is in this case the relay neuron. Now the second type of neuron is called the relay neuron. So the relay neuron is quite short, and these are nerve cells or nerve fibers found in the central nervous system, right? Usually they are all in the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain is made up of billions of these relay neurons. Okay, same with the spinal cord. So the cell body of the relay neuron is found in the gray matter of the central nervous system. Okay, in the gray matter here. And it connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So it's like the middleman. So the function of the relay neuron is to connect the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Thus, it will transmit nerve impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, right? Transmit impulses from sensory neuron to itself, and then to the motor neuron. Or it can even transmit nerve impulses from the sensory neuron to other interneurons in the central nervous system, maybe upwards to the brain and so forth. Now, looking at the structure of the relay neuron, it has dendrites that transmit impulses to the cell body, and then from there, the impulses are transmitted away from the cell body by the axon. Okay, then the impulse will flow down to the synaptic knobs. So at the front part here, the head, right, it receives impulses from the sensory neuron, and here at the ends here, it will transmit impulses to the motor neuron. So the structure of the relay neuron is quite similar to that of the motor neuron, but here it does not have the myelin sheath, okay, like the one in the textbook. It does not have myelin sheath surrounding the axon, coating the axon, compared to the motor neuron that has a myelin sheath surrounding the axon. Now, the third type of neuron is the motor neuron, which we've already discussed at the beginning. So the motor neuron has a cell body at the front end, and then it also has dendrites to transmit impulses to the cell body, and it has a long axon to transmit impulses away from the cell body to the synaptic knobs here. Now, the location of the motor neuron, it is found in the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Okay, so this is the ventral root of the spinal nerve, which does not have any ganglion. All right. Now, the cell body is present in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So, cell body of the motor neuron is found in the gray matter here, together with the cell body of the relay neuron. Okay, cell body of relay neuron and motor neuron are both in the gray matter, but the cell body of the sensory neuron is in the ganglion, the dorsal root ganglion. All right. Now, what's the function of the motor neuron? It receives nerve impulses from the relay neuron in the central nervous system here, and then it sends the nerve impulses to the effectors such as the muscles or glands in order to produce the appropriate response. For example, if a person is pricked by a pin, then the muscle will contract, and the biceps muscle may contract, okay, to bend the arm and pull the hand away from the object that causes pain, right? Right, let's look at a question that may be asked in the exam. Compare and contrast the sensory neuron, relay neuron, and motor neuron. 8 marks. Now, usually you'll be asked to compare only two neurons. For example, sensory neuron and motor neuron, or sensory neuron and relay neuron. Okay, here to get a complete picture, we discuss the differences between the three neurons. So when you ask to compare, you have to give the similarities and differences. Okay, let's start with similarities. All three neurons transmit nerve impulses, that's their function, from dendrites to cell body and then to axon. Okay, in that sequence. Now, all three neurons have these structures: dendrites, cell body, and axons. Okay, now let's look at the differences. From the aspect of function, the sensory neuron transmits nerve impulses from receptors to the central nervous system, such as the brain or the spinal cord. For the relay neuron, it transmits nerve impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So here I've arranged the three neurons in the correct order for you. Okay. So one neuron is connected to the next. The tail of one neuron, the end of one neuron will be connected to the head or the front of the next neuron. Okay. Now, the relay neuron transmits nerve impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron and is located in the central nervous system, the CNS. Please write out in full, central nervous system. Don't write CNS. Okay? So I write CNS here because these are short notes and it'll help you to remember better, easier, more easily if we use the short form. Now, the motor neuron has the function of transmitting nerve impulses from the central nervous system, actually it transmits impulses from the relay neuron in the central nervous system to the effectors. Next, the location of the cell body in the human body. Where's the cell body of the neuron? So for the sensory neuron, the cell body is always located in the ganglion, which is a swelling on the dorsal root near to the spinal cord. For the relay neuron, all the relay neurons are found in the central nervous system. All right, that means they are found in the spinal cord and brain. For example, the brain contains billions of these relay neurons. Okay, now the motor neuron, it is located in the central nervous system. It's cell body only. Okay, the cell body is located in the central nervous system, but the axon is located in the ventral root, right? But here we are talking about the cell body. So the cell body of the motor neuron is in the central nervous system. That is the spinal cord and brain. So what are the other differences between the three types of neurons? Now, from the aspect of the structure of the cell, okay, let's say you're asked to give differences between the structures of the three neurons. All right, then you can state number 3, number 5, and even number 4. Okay, but the best two are 3 and 5 here. Okay, let's start. The position of the cell body in the neuron. For sensory neuron, the cell body is at the side of the neuron, not at the front end. Okay, but for the relay neuron and motor neuron, both of these neurons have cell bodies at the front end of the neuron. Okay, next, for dendron and dendrites. The sensory neuron has one long dendron here. How to identify where the dendron is? First of all, look for the receptor. Look for the dendrites first and the receptors. This is the front end of the neuron. So this structure here is the dendron because it transmits the impulses towards the cell body, to the cell body. Okay, and the structure that comes after this, that transmits impulses away from the cell body, must be the axon. Okay, so the sensory neuron has one long dendron here. The dendron tends to be long, and it has many short dendrites at the end here. Now, for the relay neuron, usually they don't mention dendrons. Okay, dendron is usually used for the sensory neuron only in this case. Just many dendrites. It's many short dendrites that transmit nerve impulses to the cell body. Same for the motor neuron. It's the same like for the relay neuron. Okay, many short dendrites. Now, how about the axon? So the axon is quite different and it's clearly seen to be different. The axons of the three neurons. The sensory neuron has a short axon, okay, from the cell body onwards to the end of the neuron. The relay neuron has a short axon also because it is a short neuron overall is very short, is found in the central nervous system, and there are numerous relay neurons in the central nervous system, right? So the axon is also short. The one with the long axon is the motor neuron. Okay, its axon can be very long, and it can extend from the spinal cord, the base of the spinal cord, to the effectors in the feet, for example, or in the legs. So it can be more than a meter long, right? So sensory neuron and relay neuron have short axons, but the motor neuron has a long axon. Now finally, the location of the neuron in the body. The sensory neuron is found in the skin, eyes, ears, and nose because it is connected to the sensory receptors, as its function is to transmit impulses from the receptors to the central nervous system. All right? And then if you look at the spinal cord, the structure of the spinal cord, part of the sensory neuron is in the dorsal root, okay? Including the cell body, which is in the ganglia. Now for relay neuron, the relay neuron is found mostly found in the central nervous system. Okay, it's found in the central nervous system, which consists of the spinal cord and brain. So the brain is full of, is made up of many relay neurons. Okay, numerous relay neurons. Now the motor neuron is found in muscles and glands to connect to the effectors as it transmits nerve impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors. All right, and then the axon of the motor neuron is found in the ventral root. All right. So if you're asked to give differences between the structures, choose number 3 and 4 as the more obvious differences. Okay. Then if you need to give 3, then put in this dendron and dendrites. We've already studied the structure and functions of the neurons. Let's go on to study the structure and functions of synapses, or the synapse. So this topic is important as it is popular in the SPM past years series. All right. So please take note of this topic. Now, definition for nerve impulses. They are electrical signals carrying information that are sent along neurons, and they are positively charged waves. They are positive charges that flow along the axon to the synaptic knob. So as we have discussed earlier, like for example, the motor neuron, its axon will branch out at the ends to form the synaptic knobs, which are tiny swellings at the end of the axon branches. All right. So let's say this is one synaptic knob. Now, after the synaptic knob, there is a space in between it and the next neuron. So the neurons do not touch each other directly. They are not in contact with each other. There's always a gap, a tiny gap between the neurons. All right, between the synaptic knob of one neuron with the dendrite of another neuron. Okay, so this gap is called the synapse. All right, the textbook defines the synapse as a narrow gap that separates the synaptic knob of one neuron from the dendrites of the next neuron that receives the impulse. All right. Now, actually, the synapse includes also the membrane here, the membrane of the synaptic knob and the membrane of the dendrite. Okay. But in this case, the textbook has labeled this synapse as the gap here, just the gap here. Okay. Actually, the gap here is also called the synaptic cleft. Cleft means the gap there. All right. So if you see the term synaptic cleft here, label the gap as synaptic cleft. Just think of it as the synapse according to our biology syllabus. Okay. Because the synapse, according to the biology syllabus definition, is the gap. So it's interchangeable with the synaptic cleft in this instance. Right. But when you are writing the answer, refer to the synapse as synapse, not synaptic cleft. So always use the terms that are used in the textbook. Right. Electrical signals that carry information must be transmitted across the synapses somehow. So to the next neuron. So how are they transmitted? We'll find out in a short while. Now, synapses allow the nerve impulses to travel in only one direction. So this is very important. That is from the synaptic knobs at axon terminals or at the end of axons to the dendrites of the next neuron, and not the other way around, not from the dendrite to the axon. Okay. Now, the reason why it can allow nerve impulses to travel only one direction. How I can ensure that is because in the synaptic knot, there are synaptic vesicles, all right, which are involved in the transmission of nerve impulses. Okay, and the dendrite doesn't have the synaptic vesicles. And then on the dendrite, we have receptor proteins that are not found on the synaptic knobs. Okay, so these two structures are in the right place for the transmission of nerve impulses. Now, please don't confuse synapse with synapses. Let's look at the note at the bottom. Synapses, if you can recall, in chapter 6, is the pairing of homologous chromosomes in prophase 1 of meiosis 1, okay, during cell division. Whereas synapse is the narrow gap that separates the synaptic knob of one neuron from dendrites of the next neuron. So the plural form of synapse is synapses. You add an S here. Okay, so the difference is here is SES, and for synapses is SIS. So in this diagram, we can see the location of a synapse. For example, this is neuron A and this is neuron B. So at the end of the axon of neuron A, we have the synaptic knob here, and there's a gap between the synaptic knob and the dendrite of the next neuron. Okay, so this gap is called the synapse. And we're going to study how impulses are transmitted across or through the synapse, which is by means of neurotransmitters, represented by the dots here. Now let's discuss the transmission of impulses across a synapse. All right. So this diagram will be explained in the next slide in more detail, right? Don't worry about that. But first, let's look at the meaning of the word neurotransmitters. Okay, it comes from the word neuron and transmit, meaning to carry something. In this instance, to carry the impulse or transmit the impulse. So neurotransmitters are the chemical substances that help to transmit impulses chemically across synapses or the gaps between the neurons. They are kept in the synaptic vesicles found at the end of the synaptic knot. So the synaptic vesicles are round organelles that store or keep the neurotransmitter molecules inside. All right. Now, so examples of neurotransmitters found in the synapses are acetylcholine, noradrenaline, serotonin, and dopamine. Try to remember these names. So the neurotransmitters are found in the synapse, and they help to transmit the impulse from the synaptic knot to the dendrite of the next neuron. Okay? Now, how they're going to do it, we'll discuss in a short while. Now, the transmission of impulses through synapses is slow as it occurs chemically. So for the impulse to be transmitted by the neurotransmitters here, shown in yellow, have to diffuse across the synapse to the other side and bind to receptor proteins on the dendrite of the receiving neuron. Okay, so this occurs more slowly compared to the transmission of electrical impulses, okay, in the axon or the dendron. All right, that's very fast compared to the transmission of nerve impulses through the synapse or the gaps between the neurons. Now, lastly, at first, the electrical signal is changed to a chemical signal in the form of a neurotransmitter. All right, and then the neurotransmitter diffuses across the synapse to the dendrite of the receiving neuron. And then the chemical substance is converted again to electrical signal. That means the electrical impulse on the membrane of the receiving neuron. And then the electrical impulse will be transmitted through the neuron. So basically what this means is that when the electrical impulse arrives at the synaptic knob, it is electrical in nature, but it has to be changed to a chemical signal in the form of the neurotransmitter. That means the neurotransmitters will be released from the synaptic vesicles into the synapse, okay, when the impulse has arrived at the synaptic knob. So the electrical signal has changed to a chemical signal in the form of the neurotransmitters. Then these neurotransmitters diffuse across the synapse to the dendrite of the receiving neuron. And then after binding to the receptor protein, a new impulse will be produced in the receiving neuron, in the dendrite of the receiving neuron. So this impulse is back again to be an electrical impulse, right? So then that means the chemical substance has again been converted back to an electrical signal on the membrane of the receiving neuron. Let's find out more about the steps taken in the transmission of nerve impulses across a synapse. Now let's look at an important question which is very popular in the SPM past years series. Explain the transmission of impulses across a synapse. 8 marks. So here we're going to discuss the steps involved in the transmission of impulses across a synapse, alright, in the right sequence, starting from when the impulse arrives at the synaptic knob here, right? So when electrical impulses, number one, reach the synaptic knob, synaptic vesicles, such as these, with the red particles inside, are stimulated. So the synaptic vesicle will move to the membrane, alright, of the synaptic knob, and it will release the neurotransmitters into the synapse, as shown here, right? An example of a neurotransmitter is dopamine. So give an example. Now, 1 tick is about 1 mark. Okay, it's 1 mark. So number 2, the neurotransmitters have been released into the synapse, and they diffuse through the synapse to the other neuron. They must combine with a specific receptor protein found on the membrane of the receiving neuron. Okay, found on the membrane of the dendrite of the receiving neuron. Number 3, the neurotransmitter will then bind to the receptor, okay, to the receptor protein. And this will stimulate the initiation of the next impulse. That means it will stimulate the production of a new impulse, an electrical impulse, okay? Then this impulse is transmitted through this next neuron here. Now, another point that we can mention is the adaptation of the neuron, all right, to transmit nerve impulses across the synapse. And that is, at the synaptic knob, there are many mitochondria, numerous mitochondria, to generate a lot of energy which is needed for the transmission of nerve impulses through the synapse. All right, that's the function of the mitochondria. Because energy is needed for transmission of nerve impulses through the synapse. Right, so now let's look at an animation, all right, of what we have discussed. Just look at the picture here and we will look at the animation. So the first step is when the impulse, electrical impulse, arrives at the synaptic knob. The synaptic vesicles are stimulated to release neurotransmitters into the synapse. Then the neurotransmitters diffuse through the synapse and combine with specific receptor proteins on the dendrites or on the dendrite of the receiving neuron. The binding of the neurotransmitter and the receptor stimulates the initiation of the next impulse. And this impulse is transmitted through the next neuron. Now let's look at this interesting new hot question that may be asked in the SPM. Explain how a snake or cobra's venom, that means the poison, attacks the nervous system to cause paralysis and death after it has bitten its victim. 5 marks. Okay, so pause the video and try and think of an answer, and you can read up the textbook. There's in this subtopic there is a comment about the snake's poison. Okay, so try and think of the answer and explain in detail. So let's look at the answer. Now, firstly, the cobra's venom or poison, or the snake's poison, prevents or blocks the action of neurotransmitters. So when the poison enters the body, it will act at the synapses, okay, in the body, and it will prevent or block the action of the neurotransmitters. It will prevent the neurotransmitters in the synapse from diffusing across to the receptor proteins. So the nerve impulses cannot be transmitted across the synapses, all right, to the muscle cells. Now what happens when muscle cells don't receive the nerve impulses? They cannot be stimulated, okay, without nerve impulses. So the muscle fibers cannot contract without stimulation by nerve impulses. So this will cause paralysis of the victim's body, in which the victim will be unable to move. And if untreated, the diaphragm in the body, which is needed for breathing mechanism, the breathing mechanism, will be paralyzed. So it will be unable to help carry out the mechanism of breathing, where it contracts and relaxes. So the victim will not be able to breathe and will finally die. Okay? So if treatment is given, then through the injection of antitoxin, something that can neutralize the poison, then the patient may be able to be saved. Here are a few questions for formative exercise 12.3. Right, read through these questions, pause the video and try to answer the questions first. Then we'll discuss the answers in a short while. All right, let's look at the answers. The first question, what are the functions of the sensory neuron and the motor neuron? So the sensory neuron transmits nerve impulses from receptors in the sensory organs to the central nervous system, such as the brain or spinal cord. Whereas the motor neuron transmits nerve impulses from the relay neuron in the central nervous system, such as in the spinal cord, to an effector, such as muscles or glands, for an appropriate response to be carried out. Number 2, why does a synaptic knob contain a lot of mitochondria? It is to generate the energy needed for the transmission of nerve impulses through the synapse. Number 3, how are nerve impulses transmitted through synapse? Okay, it's just 2 marks, so we have to be brief about it. But for essay questions, when more marks are involved, you have to explain in more detail. Okay, so here is only 2 marks. Now answer. Nerve impulses are transmitted through the synapse chemically by means of neurotransmitters. Not neutro, it's neurotransmitters. All right, some people like to write neutro. So it's neurotransmitters. Now there's 1 mark for this term, neurotransmitters. You can also give examples like acetylcholine, dopamine, or serotonin. Next, explain what happens to the neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters diffuse across a synapse and combine with receptor proteins on the dendrite of the receiving neuron. Okay, so here there may be 2 or even 3 marks for this answer. All right, the question may be worth about 2 or 3 marks. Now next question, the last question, predict what would happen to the transmission of impulses if a neuron lacks a myelin sheath, right? So this is a prediction question. Now please take note that to answer the question, don't explain the function of myelin sheath, all right? Just explain what would happen if there is no myelin sheath, okay? So you must know the function of the myelin sheath, all right? Now what will happen to the transmission of impulses, all right? This aspect. So the transmission of nerve impulses will be slowed down. Why? Because without a myelin sheath, there will be no nodes of Ranvier, no gaps in between the parts of the myelin sheath. Then the impulses cannot jump from one node of Ranvier to the next node of Ranvier. Thus, the impulses will have to flow through the axon all the way through the axon fiber or projection, and that will slow down the transmission of nerve impulses. Okay, so this question is actually testing your knowledge about the function of nodes of Ranvier. The function of nodes of Ranvier. Right, that's all for this lesson. Thanks for viewing. I hope that you have benefited from the teaching, and please share, like, and subscribe. See you again in the next video. Goodbye for now.